So, Dare,
Mhm.
what are you most interested in right now?
I've been doing a lot of research based on other people's research, obviously, but Middle Stone Age ancestral dynamics, the beginnings of culture, the beginnings of language, and the beginning of symbolic thinking, which essentially is like where we get ritual and ritual theater, because at a certain point they weren't necessarily separate.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this, there's the dynamics of like what were the conditions socially, environmentally, that sort of drove or motivated our ancestors to sort of have to innovate certain behavioral patterns that then became ingrained over time, and then 300,000 years later, this is us now. So I've been really psyched about that kind of research currently, and how it sort of shows kind of like the ABCs in a way of metaphorical thinking, of why language is so powerful but also so deceptive, how we use metaphors, how essentially we created metaphorical structures, in the Stone Age.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, way before rational thought, there was sort of like symbolic, metaphoric,
Mm-hmm.
almost like very complex charades. Like if you think of the charades game, but like not with the sort of grammar we use today, but with a kind of more like physical theater grammar,
Right.
sign
Mhm.
language, singing, all combined into like a kind of storytelling model. It's happening way back then.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm thinking about what we've been calling contemplative theater processes or contemplative theater structures, and I just experimented with some of these things inside of a playground session called Social Curious, and there's this practice that we do where one person is sourcing from their own sense of pleasure and massage, like they have the option to massage their face and then speak in gibberish, right? So
Mhm.
like no actual discernible language,
Mhm.
but still sourcing from an authentic desire to communicate, and not necessarily communicate about just themselves, but in general, right? So like weaving in a kind of environmental awareness and allowing that to be part of the gesturing. And then the other person, because we need this kind of healing, the other person finds within themselves a genuine and authentic, oh, that makes sense. And they actually say that out loud to the other person, and they go back and forth.
Sure.
Even though there's like, how do you know? How do you know what you think you know about what the person is saying? Which is always true, even if people are using like very precise language, it's actually always true on some level. How do you know that you're really like getting something?
Yeah, totally.
But that, I think that primordial impulse to gesture together and to like point together and understand together and like gather information together is what I'm also really interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point, especially as I'm thinking about the retreat coming up in September, I'm at a point where I'm combining like every group theater based training I've ever had, which includes, there's theater of the oppressed, specifically like interactive theater, where there's audience participation and many opportunities to set scenes up and then interrupt them or actually change them.
Mm-hmm.
There's viewpoints, which is a method of deconstructing movement largely that was like created by movement artists, but deconstructing and basically allowing like all possible form to be considered a dance, and to do that in a group. And then of course there's like just full-blown ritual inside of that, and improvisational ritual where there can be dancing, there can be singing, there can be prayer and conversation with spirit, that uses all those things. Especially in viewpoints, uses all those elements, but for like a particular group purpose that's not just like
Open-ended.
Open-ended
Sure.
or experimenting. And then also using systems constellations, which is also about having a particular question or a particular issue you're looking at, and
Mhm.
using co-sensing processes to start to get more information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, what this brings up for me is like play as research, ceremony as research, then ceremony as play, and play as ceremony. So all of these things are also talking to each other, and the scientific method, actually this is just a basic method of inquiry that our ancestors sort of developed, sort of tracking animals and patterns of weather in order to survive. This kind of inquiry process of herbology, like basic herbology, but also social dynamics. Play is, extremely important, and I think largely misidentified in our current world. Like, we don't really have a robust idea of play, I guess you could say, mechanics or structures that would allow for some of these sort of undigested, for lack of a better term, trauma responses, threat responses to be actually sort of dealt with.
Yeah.
I mean, because that's the thing that we're really dealing with as like animal beings. We're constantly inside of various threat responses, and really the only way to deal with that is to have some form of playful interaction with phenomenon in general. And contemplative theater or these play-based practices can help us sort of engage and then sort of gain some distance from the engagement and then re-engage. And doing that over and over and over again with our internal process and our external kind of containers or groups, that's the complexity required to sort of get enough data to even change some of these default behaviors that were so kind of have such momentum behind them. They're so hungry in a way. Our culture has such hungry ghost impulse issues,
Right.
And really it's about, play as a means to research the potential to change direction on some level.
Right.
Right?
Right, exactly. So I'm curious about this question. When do you feel like the work or process is most free or available to do what it's meant to do, or to do what it needs to do? Like, what are the conditions that allow that process to really be functional?
Yeah, like the feng shui of or the Goldilocks zone, or whatever people want to call it, this kind of just right place or something. I mean, I think, this is like a can of worms. You can open up a can of worms because every single person has sort of different access needs and different kind of karmic baggage or burdens or whatever.
Right, like the most basic layer has to be that everybody involved knows at least like some minimum requirements that their system needs in order to show up in with integrity in a space, and then also to maintain that integrity when you go into negotiation about how the space is going to be held and what's going to happen, and to opt in and out, if you need to.
Yeah.
Um, Right. So, and that already takes a lot of a certain kind of like emotional like artistic distance, right? Because there are so many examples where, I mean, people are exhausted and burnt out at all the places where they're actually, they can't really access, or they can't really be comfortable, or fully participate inside of, because of all
Yeah,
the ways those conversations aren't happening.
well, you need some self-reflective awareness so that you can kind of have a kind of, you know your limits, or you know what your willingness kind of level is, or kind of like how to not hurt yourself or exhaust yourself in
Right.
any given like situation.
Yep. Yep.
So you need some self-reflective capacity, and I think that the interesting thing about these processes is that they also act as diagnostic feedback loops.
Right.
Is that you can do little processes that actually help you really check in with what is happening for you and go, oh yeah, I actually am at less spoons than I thought I was coming in.
Totally.
And then you actually have a more authentic ability then, because you're not essentially lying to yourself, even though it wasn't conscious. You actually can really get it's like a real current check-in. Like maybe your last real check-in was 2 days ago.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to go, oh, I have to really check in again. Actually, this is where I'm at.
Yeah.
And I think that's difficult for a lot of people, because there's too much risk, and kind of there's like too much risk in the field of like, will you like me? Will I get what I want? Like there's a lot of risk involved, and so a lot of these processes tend to be a little bit like almost asocial. Like you start to get into this kind of like parallel play dynamic where you are playing together, but it's not necessarily the same game or something, and there's a real ability to kind of let people kind of blob around until everyone's kind of warmed up. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think a lot of what I like to try to integrate into any kind of structure or process is an on-ramping, or like a warm-up period where it's like people have to fully transition and fully land, and then also we really need to be like reminded and guided on differentiation and interconnection at the same time, and that you actually have options inside of that, but you also have to prime people to recognize how often we take those movements personally, how often we take someone moving toward us or away from us personally, which then creates a lot of tension in the field of being able to play, because then everyone is assuming that there are secondary and tertiary and like endless stories like being narrated all the time that aren't explicit, that aren't being like stated out loud, but all these like hidden upsets or hidden consequences that might come later because you moved in the space in a certain way. And I think we both need to be able to train in a way that we can actually relax that hyper like narration, taking everything very personally insecure place that so many of us have, but then to also build a kind of resilience and like tolerance for the fact that like that's probably going to happen.
Sure, that's like
and
a
like
sub
we can
thing. It's like a subroutine happening all the time.
And that we can also build flexibility and patience and more leeway or like willingness inside of the fact that it happens too. So also reducing our threat response that comes up when we realize like people are actually failing to hold themselves and might start being in that narrative place, because the habits are just that strong. And I think everybody just kind of needs to be in this like generous detox, co-detoxing like time together, and you do need like duration, right? Which is also why you and I often talk about wanting to do this more retreat style type thing where you really just get a chance to marinate and like unwind,
Yeah.
before you start doing some of this more intensive learning, because otherwise you're learning still under that deep social like tension, and everything you're learning also starts to get kind of like can get entangled
Right.
with that pattern that's already there.
Right, which just reinforces the pattern. It's not necessarily freeing ourselves from the patterns. We're not really seeing the true possibility of the liberation that's inherent in our perception, but we have to train ourselves back to almost like a kind of like clean slate, as in you before you use the chalkboard, you kind of erase the chalkboard from the last time you were doing something on the chalkboard. It's a kind of process where you are sweeping the space of your mind. Even though you know it's going to get dirty again, you sweep it anyway, because when it's primed or when it's cleaned up, what happens there sort of fits differently in the already existing milieu of the your system. You know, I tend to think of it like it's a reculturing process, because everything we do creates culture. We're just adding to culture all the time, but something for me about the phrase reculturing, it's like we don't want to erase culture because we couldn't. There's no way to really erase culture, but we can sort of reculture. We can sort of continually update the program, if you will. We can kind of reculture together and alone and together and alone and together.
Right, back to that, like, for us, it's all about researching that point of possible change. Where inside of culture making do you create openings so that some kind of like real complete learning or complete awareness can come in, so that like the next thing can make itself known.
Right, that's that emerging, like when something is really fresh and no one really planned it consciously.
Right. But the only way you can really get there that I've seen is like you have to have a solid like internal death practice or good strong sense of secure attachment to your life and reality, because you really have to find that like essential place inside of you, and it is in everyone and it is everywhere, which is like we're talking about researching the point of possibility, and the point of possibility is actually a primordial force that is inside of everything that you can call on or remember, or there are many, many different practices to like get you in touch with it. And if you built confidence over time with that relationship to that source point of like complete potential, complete openness, complete secure attachment to death and life and reality, right? Where you're getting a glimpse of the part of you that is essentially like not grasping for anything, it's not pushing anything away. It is completely awake and aware and available just to the unfolding of what's happening. We need people to be able to source from that all the time in order to do the thing we're talking about, which is actually hear the next right step that's trying to emerge.
Right. So there's a real letting, like on some level it's a letting go of what you think is right or certain, but on another level you're holding fast to certain principles that actually help you let go.
Right.
So it's not letting go of everything and just becoming a fucking open blob or something, but there is a capacity of like everyone having to learn what inside of them is the right things to let go and the right things to hold on to, that create this perfect little basket of like readiness, because you're actually trying to, it's like if someone was trying to throw a ball, you don't know where the ball is going to go, and if your hands are closed or if you're looking away, you're not really ready for it.
Right. Yeah.
So you kind of have to develop this readiness, but the readiness isn't like, well, I'm just going to lay down on the ground. It's like, no, because then you wouldn't catch the ball either. Complete and total relaxation isn't the goal. and complete and total tension isn't the goal, but this kind of dynamism that is constantly kind of, moving, but has a quality that you can track over time that you could say, oh, that's what being ready feels like or looks like or sounds like or something.
Right. I sometimes describe this as relaxed alive in energetic integrity. So it encompasses all of those things, which is basically like it's like a fundamental attunement both to your own system's rhythms, but also to the environmental influences, and knowing like when to like zoom into those influences and also when to zoom out.
Yeah.
When to like sometimes information that comes, it's like very clear and it's very strong and it just kind of comes as a bundle, and there's like really in that first flush of receiving it, there's not a lot of confusion. It just came as like very purely. And other times it's like you've got to use all your tools to like keep laying it out and keep checking your work, keep checking in with like your central channel and your sense of essence, and like all these ways that we just want things to be a certain way, because as biological organisms we do have that kind of like craving part of our nature.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the science of play, all the ways that we can play, because essentially play is a kind of, it's really interesting. So, the research that I've done is to see that play is in some ways a reverse dominance pattern. So reverse dominance being like there are habitual animalistic tendencies in humankind that are dominance based. I want it, I need it now, I crave it, I go get it, I do whatever I can. So very dominance based, task dominance based. And in this, we can do this to the environment and we can do this to each other, and it's very sad that there is a lot of that in the world. But way back, before our brains were as big as they are now, our ancestors sort of had the inkling that, because you can watch animals do this in the wild too, like all babies, especially all mammalian babies, they play to a certain point in their developmental age cycle. And once they hit this kind of puberty cycle, especially the men, the boys, play becomes not play, it becomes real. So play fighting becomes real fighting. And what our ancestors had to figure out was how to reverse dominate so that you could keep the play response consciously after puberty hits. Because at that point, there's this tipping point that is, it's real now, and I really have to hurt you to get what I want. And, it's very hard to talk about these things because we're still kind of living in that kind of society, this dominant society. But 250,000 years ago, our ancestors it was much worse is what I'm saying. It was much worse. And in order to have safe enough, long enough time periods for culture to actually develop, that's something we would consider culture, there had to be a safe enough, long enough period of time, and that there was a bunch of strategies to do that, but this play as a reverse dominance to kind of train people from infancy through puberty so that they could remember this play behavior set, especially when they started to think that it was time to fight. And this is important because in that moment when you feel like you actually have to fight, you may not actually have to fight, but you believe you do. And that's the problem. And so our ancestors, our grandmothers essentially, the black grandmother hypothesis of culture, is that we had to take care of each other intergenerationally, but also teach ourselves intergenerationally how to play together. Babies, teenagers, adults, and the elderly, all playing constantly to reinforce this kind of suppression of the dominance urge that we have as animals,
Yeah, if you think about it, play is an ambiguous space. Play is an open space. Play is a space where there's like the shape of it, even just feeling into the word, is really, really different than the shape or the energetic signature of being in a state of feeling like you have to do something, right? Like
Right.
you must fight now, you must run now, you must
Eat
defend
now.
now, you must eat now, you must have this now. Like there's this kind of like very, the focus gets very narrow, which is good because we need narrow focus sometimes in order to really continue to function as an organism, right? You do have to eat, you do have to shit, you do have to defend yourself sometimes. It's like this is not a non-violent reality, but play requiring a whole different kind of set of conditions is actually about opening. It's about incorporating greater complexity. It's why play and learning are closely associated in so much research, and learning also being an inherently emergent property, right? You're actually building your neural networks in a particular way based on the feedback that you're getting. And I think theoretically, if there's more relaxation, more openness, and more relaxation inside of ambiguity, inside of not needing one-pointed answers, inside of not needing super rigid rules, fixed structures that like have no flexibility to them, a different kind of neural network I think is possible and
Right.
and available,
Right.
like develops, right? A different kind of physiological pathways start to become available.
Well, that's true agency. Agency is both having the capacity to do those, I guess we could call them sort of like short-term, immediate gratification neural network, which is like, I need to do it now. Like, we actually need that. Like, if you don't have that, you're going to have a real hard time in life. You have to be able to, like, say no, which is a defense protocol. You might have to fight, you might have to run, you might have to do something and not like have a lot of wiggle room and the optionality of that. But the secondary neural network that has to be developed, and then the two networks kind of integrating, it's almost like a dual consciousness. You need to have this capacity to be agential, be able to have this sort of narrow focused, short-term, now kind of urgent task-based decision-making process and enacting the decision-making process, not just having it, but doing it. And then this more sort of open, flexible neural network that actually allows you to go, but how? And can I play inside of the need that I have to have it now?
Right.
So you're doing both and most people, they're switching. And
Right.
there's some conditions where they're open and there's some conditions where they're like more immediate. But the training is more about having both options doing this together all the time. Not like a switch on, switch off, but like a constantly flexible permutation of both short-term and long-term ambiguous play and short-term sort of non-ambiguous, demand decision making, and just have that be more, permeable inside your system. There's training to do that.
Right. And it can be really relieving to actually smooth those transitions. Like I think there's something about the principle of continuity inside of everything, where it just so happens that if we create more bridges and like smoother transitions between things, it just seems to feel better, and like the network is happier because it actually has more communication in more directions, which means it has more information, which means it has a fuller picture and can show up like in new ways that it couldn't before, when that gap was like feeling really harsh. Because what can happen sometimes is like people experience the gap as actually a threat, right?
Totally.
And then
because they don't know how to make a decision.
Right, and then everything closes down, right? Everything closes down, and you start to reinforce something really challenging inside of your system about how to navigate that space. But I think what we're saying over and over again, and what I think is emulated in a lot of our design, is that there are so many ways to play with what your system is doing. So many, like I would argue, infinite ways and infinite subtleties and infinite realms to source from in order to just engage with being alive. And this is where it starts to really open up for me into something actually like moving from a survivalist, like, oh, we gotta help people, oh, humans are like really struggling, into just a like very basic, ordinary fascination and invigoration about how it is that anything is functioning at all in reality, the way that things are alive.
Well, you've said before, it's like you learn to play in the gap. You learn to play in the unknown space.
Mm-hmm.
So if you play in the unknown space, it's not so threatening anymore. And then all the times in your life, you can actually notice that it's actually unknown rather than trying to control it.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, that's the issue most people have, is like if everyone's trying to control the game, no one is having any fun.
And that's where the fun comes in, right? This is the thing that's so tough. It's like we have a lot of entrainment around avoiding that place, particularly avoiding that place of like completely opening up and like not being guided from a rational mind, but being guided from maybe something top down or bottom up, or something even, bigger and non-human.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of entrainment that creates hesitation and trepidation and terror around that moment, but that's also where everything is fun and where you get this like fresh inspiration about the way that reality is working. It's from that place. It's you can bring that freshness of that open space into what is already habitual. You can start to recognize how it is inside of that all of the time, and you can bring like fresh blood to your life in that way. But you've got to be touching that open place, right? You've got to be touching that emergent space.
Right, the I don't know place.
In order to remember it everywhere else that it's happening.
Like eventually, after doing this for years, the baseline becomes I don't know, and that doesn't like create a crazy threat response.
Totally.
You just go, oh, I don't know. That's actually great.
Isn't that delightful? Yeah.
Yeah, like because I don't know, there's so many possibilities. So that's actually, you keep widening that aperture in your system to go, I don't know what could happen, rather than I don't know, I need to hide and like fight this feeling because I don't know is dangerous.
Totally.
And in some regard, it is dangerous.
Right.
That's the thing you have to recognize. It's not like it's not dangerous.
Yep.
It is dangerous, but we have an ability to go, it's dangerous, and I can behave in certain ways around this unknown possible danger, and that's where the magic is. That's where the magic is. And that's a thing that people have to figure out on their own. Like we can talk about it, and we can say that it's possible in groups, and people can even feel it happen in groups sometimes, but to do it consciously in groups on command, that's the thing. That's the real game, on command, not just like, oh, well, it happens when it happens.
Yeah.
It's like, no. We could actually do it on purpose. We could do it on purpose.
Feels like a good end.
I think it's probably the end for this one.